safe. And while they're there for the next 6 months, they're mostly fighting boredom. The war's over. There's no more bullets flying between them and Confederate soldiers. What they've enlisted to do has already been done. But here they are at these isolated posts along the river, responding to cattle rustlers and possibly Indian raids, but nothing else. Many of the officers resign and go home. The war's over. They don't want any more of this. And discipline begins to deteriorate. Men decide to desert their regiments in increasing numbers. They're treated well by the Mexican-American population along the Rio Grande with food. And they leave the ranks, knowing that perhaps life is going to be better here than it would be back in Kentucky, or back in Virginia, or back in Mississippi. And at the same time, because there's not much fresh water, because there are poor rations, hot weather, there's a great deal of sickness. And in probably the most unfortunate aspect of this story, these men who had fought at Appomattox and survived the battle, survived the war itself, nearly 400 of them will succumb to disease, particularly things like dysentery and scurvy, yellow fever, and cholera. At one point, half of the entire 25th Corps is on the sick list. That's how bad the conditions were. And chaplain of the 25th Corps, one of them, said this: "No set of men in any country ever suffered more severely than we in Texas. Death has made fearful gaps in every regiment." And these regiments will begin to be mustered out of service and sent back home, starting in November of 1865. And if they were organized in a free state like Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia regiments, they're sent home first. The 116th, those former slaves of Kentucky, are going to be the last to get out of the Army, and that's not until January of 1867, after serving in New Orleans for a while as well. And for some of these men, particularly the 116th, they decide, I'm not returning home to Kentucky. There's nothing there for me. I might not have family there. They decide to re-enlist in the regular United States Army, particularly into the 9th U.S. Cavalry. And they basically become what we would know as Buffalo Soldiers the years after the war. But they had also been here at Appomattox, about 120 men, the 116th. At the end of the war, summer of 1865, the U.S. Army was 10% African American. By the fall, as those white regiments head home, nearly a third of all men in blue uniforms are black. They're some of the last to muster out. Now, post-war, what are these men going to be faced with? Well, does racism and discrimination go away just because the war is over? Certainly not. Just because of emancipation, it does not. Men from the north, Pennsylvania, New York, their return home, their communities haven't been disturbed too much by the war. Their families are safe. They've known that all along. Former slaves, on the other hand, what are they going to be returned to? Those individuals we mentioned from this part of Virginia, while they were gone, what had happened to their families, they may not know. If they had been enlisted in a refugee camp in northern Virginia, along the Mississippi River, they may not know what had happened to their families, where they are, what work could I receive when I go home, what can I get, how am I going to live? All those questions needed an answer when these men get home. A great deal of uncertainty. And on top of it, some of them never get that money that was promised them. Now these men, especially from the South, these former slaves, when they get paid their money every month, and they get their bounty of $100, or they get their substitute money, what are they supposed to do with it? They can't necessarily just hang on to it. It might get lost, it might get stolen. One thing that they often did was basically give it to one of their officers to hold on to it for them. This was done quite often, and unfortunately with bad results. Colonel William Woodward, that I mentioned, who commanded one of these brigades of USCTs, the colonel of the 116th, when he resigned in December of 1865, he had already embezzled more than $3,500 of his own soldiers' money. He became a Mississippi riverboat gambler, disappeared, never punished. So that's an unfortunate aspect of this. Those who were able to keep their bounty money, go home, perhaps were able to use it to build a better life, buy a farm, buy a home, better their families, experience their lives, educate their children. And a few examples stand out of what these men became. First Sergeant William Whipper, 31st USCT, became a judge in South Carolina during Reconstruction. Private William Simmons, 41st, United States Colored Infantry, became a Baptist minister and president of State University in St. Louis, Missouri. And despite the ending of slavery, the ending of the war, and the possibilities for these men when they return home, wherever home is, the rights they gained during Reconstruction, vote, hold office, a lot of that kind of fades away in the decades following Reconstruction. Racism, of course, continues in the North as well. Sergeant Major William McCausland, 29th USCT, following the war, said this about what he expected of the future. He said, "We, the colored soldiers, have fairly won our rights by loyalty and bravery, but shall we obtain them? If they were refused, we shall now demand them." These men have served in uniform, they fought for their country, they fought well and honorably. They deserve freedom, they deserve their rights. That's his point. And despite everything that went on after the war into the 20th century with the continuing civil rights movement, continues today, many of these men never forgot their service. They never forgot the importance of what they did on behalf of union and emancipation, for their families, for those who would come after. Even though it would take many, many years for that emancipation to be realized. During the 1930s, I'll close with this because I know I've been going on for a while, and I honestly hope I have not bored everyone. I'll close with this. In the 1930s, there was a series of interviews conducted by the Works Progress Administration of former slaves, individuals who had probably been children at the time of slavery. One person they interviewed in Richmond was a gentleman nearly 100 years old named Private William Harrison. And it turned out he'd been a private in the 45th USCT, and he had been here at Appomattox. And that came out in the interview. This is a man who was born a slave and seen quite a bit of change, and not, in 100 years. When asked about Appomattox, he had a very succinct statement that I'm going to close with. He says this: "I was with General Grant when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. That was freedom." Thank you all very much.